I used to think you could measure a man by what he builds. I believed that if you put your back into the work, whether it was a house, a career, or a family, it would stand firm against time and weather. But foundations crack, don't they? Sometimes it's slow, creeping along under the surface where you can't see it until everything caves in. Other times, the cracks spread fast, jagged and merciless, until you're left standing in the rubble, wondering how you didn't notice it sooner. That's what's been keeping me up at night. Not the silence in the bed I share with Madison, not the polite distance in her voice, or even the vague excuses about late nights. It's the question. How did I not see it? I've built skyscrapers with steel that doesn't give, poured concrete that won't bend, but I've never felt more brittle in my life than I do now, sitting in the dark kitchen with a bottle of bourbon in one hand and a phone in the other. The bourbon's there to dull the sting. The phone's there for answers. She's asleep upstairs, or pretending to be. The covers were drawn high when I left, her breathing steady, but not real. Madison used to fall asleep curled into my chest. I could feel her warmth, hear her heartbeat sync with mine. Now she's a silhouette, a stranger, someone who doesn't turn to look when I get into bed. I don't know when she stopped being my wife. The phone buzzes in my hand. It's a message from Rebecca Hart, the private investigator I hired 3 weeks ago. I stare at her name on the screen. It shouldn't have come to this, me paying someone to follow my wife, watching her through a stranger's eyes. But desperation makes a man do things he never thought he could stomach. I open the message, and the first thing that loads is a photo. It's grainy but clear enough to rip the air from my lungs. Madison is sitting in a coffee shop, her smile wide and natural, the kind I haven't seen in years. Across from her is Tyler, my brother, leaning close, his hand resting lightly on hers. There's a second photo. The two of them walking out together, her fingers brushing his arm. I down the bourbon in one long pull and set the glass down hard enough to make the table shake. My mind feels like a dam on the verge of breaking, held together by willpower alone. I've seen enough. I don't need to keep scrolling to know where this is headed. I know. 3 years. Rebecca's report says it started 3 years ago. The hotel stays, the dinners, the texts sent from burner phones. They didn't even bother being careful after the first year. Tyler's car parked outside my house when I wasn't home. Madison making excuses about work dinners while she was out with him. They built their betrayal brick by brick, right under my nose. I should have noticed sooner. I should have felt the shift. The way she stopped wearing the necklace I gave her on our 10th anniversary. The way her laugh turned hollow. The way she flinched the first time I reached for her after a long day, as though my touch was something she had to endure. I put the phone down and pressed my palms against the cool surface of the table. My pulse drums in my ears, my jaw aches from clenching. I've been here before, this edge where rage and despair meet, where you're one bad decision away from losing yourself completely. But I can't afford to lose myself. Not yet. I stand and pour another drink, staring out the window into the darkened backyard. The swing set I built for Sophia is slick with rain, the seats swaying gently in the wind. She's 8 now, growing so fast it hurts. She's the reason I haven't smashed something yet. She's the only thing keeping me tethered. Sophia doesn't know. She can't know. But she sees more than she should. Last week, she brought me a drawing, one of her little masterpieces. It was our family, but we were scattered across the page. Madison was on one side, holding hands with Tyler, while I stood on the other side, alone under storm clouds. Sophia was in the middle, reaching for me, her face turned away from them. "Why are we so far apart, baby?" I asked, keeping my voice calm even though my chest felt like it might cave in. "I don't know," she said, shrugging. "That's just how it felt." I hold on to that memory now, the sting of it grounding me. I know what I have to do. It's not just about me anymore. It's about her. She deserves better than the lies her mother and uncle have built around her. She deserves to know that her father isn't the fool they've painted him to be. I pour the bourbon back into the bottle. I'll need my head clear for this. It's time to stop pretending I don't see the cracks. It's time to tear the whole damn thing down. The house is still when I walk upstairs, the kind of silence that feels like it's hiding something. Madison's side of the bed is empty. I already knew it would be. The light under the door to the bathroom is on, a faint glow spilling onto the hardwood floor. For a moment, I stand there, staring at it, my fists clenched at my sides. I should burst in, demand answers, let the fury in my chest explode into words that will rip her to shreds. But I don't. Not yet. Instead, I step back into the hallway, my breath slow and measured. Confronting her now would feel good, but it wouldn't be smart. And if there's one thing I've learned in my years building skyscrapers, it's that the first blow isn't the one that matters. It's the foundation. If you want to bring something down, you have to start there. I retreat to the guest bedroom and close the door quietly behind me. The room smells faintly of dust and disuse, the bed untouched since my last late night in the office. I sit on the edge of the mattress, the springs groaning under my weight, and stare at the phone still clenched in my hand. Rebecca's message is still open, the photos staring back at me like a taunt. 3 years. The betrayal stretches back so far it feels impossible to untangle. I think of all the moments I trusted them both, the holidays, the weekends, the barbecues where Tyler stood beside me, flipping burgers while Madison poured drinks. I thought we were family. I thought I had something solid. I was wrong. The phone buzzes again in my hand, snapping me out of my thoughts. Another message from Rebecca. They met tonight. Same hotel. Same room. I don't reply. I don't need to. I already know where this is heading. I lean forward, elbows on my knees, and press my hands together. For a long time, I just sit there, the quiet pressing in around me. I need a plan. Something more than rage and despair. Something that will last. The next morning, I'm up before dawn. The house is still dark as I slip downstairs and into the garage. My work boots are by the door, caked in dried mud from the last site inspection. I pull them on, the familiar weight grounding me. I need air. I need to think. The driveway is slick with rain as I back the truck out and head toward the city. Denver is waking up slowly, the streets quiet except for the occasional delivery truck or jogger. I drive without a destination, letting the engine's low rumble fill the silence. My mind churns over the pieces of this mess, trying to fit them into something I can work with. By the time the sun rises, I find myself outside Jared's house. His place is neat, unassuming, tucked into a quiet cul-de-sac. I park on the street and sit there for a moment, watching the light in his kitchen flicker on. Jared's a good man, one of the few I can trust. If anyone can help me sort through this, it's him. I knock twice before he opens the door. His hair is rumpled, and he's still in sweatpants, a mug of coffee in one hand. He takes one look at my face and steps aside without a word. "You're up early," he says as I follow him into the kitchen. "So are you." He grunts, setting his mug down on the counter. "You don't look like you're here for small talk." I sit down at the table, running a hand over my face. It's worse than I thought. Jared's face hardens. He pulls out a chair and sits across from me, his elbows resting on the table. "Talk to me." I pull out my phone and slide it across the table. Jared picks it up, his eyes narrowing as he swipes through the photos. His jaw tightens, the muscle ticking as he sets the phone down. Son of a bitch, he mutters. Tyler? I nod, my throat tight. For 3 years. Jared leans back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. What do you want to do? That's the question, isn't it? I've been asking myself the same thing all night. Part of me wants to burn everything to the ground, to confront them both and let the pieces fall where they may. But that's not enough. Not for what they've done. I want to ruin them, I say, my voice low and steady. Not just end it. Destroy it. Jared's quiet for a moment, his eyes searching mine. All right, he says finally. Then we do this right. The first step is gathering everything. Jared and I sit at his table, combing through every email, every receipt, every detail Rebecca sent me. There's enough here to paint a picture, but not enough to finish it. Not yet. You need more, Jared says, flipping through the file. Something they can't weasel out of. Something that ties them both to this mess in a way they can't deny. I nod, the weight of it settling in my chest. It's not enough to catch them in the act. I need to pull up the roots, expose every lie they've told, every corner they've cut. I need to make sure they can't rebuild. Jared leans back in his chair, his fingers drumming on the table. There's the business angle, he says thoughtfully. Tyler's been sloppy lately. We've caught it on the Henderson project. If he's screwing up there, he's probably screwing up elsewhere. The idea clicks into place, sharp and undeniable. If Tyler's been cutting corners at work, it won't take much to find it. And if Madison's been involved, all the better. I feel a grim satisfaction settle over me, the kind that comes from finally knowing where to start. When I get home, the house is empty. Madison's car is gone, and Sophia is at school. The silence feels different now, less suffocating, more focused. I walk into the kitchen, grab a notepad, and start writing. Step 1, investigate Tyler's work. Step 2, check Madison's accounts. Step 3, watch. Wait. I set the pen down and look out the window at the swing set again. The rain has stopped, but the clouds haven't cleared. They will, eventually. But not before the storm does what it's meant to do. The following week, I learned just how long 7 days could feel. Time slowed down, each moment dragging as I put my plan into motion. I wanted action, something to unleash the fire burning in my chest, but I forced myself to be patient. There's no victory in a rushed demolition, only rubble. If I was going to destroy them, I had to do it right. I started with Tyler. Jared and I spent hours combing through the Henderson project files. Tyler had handled the contracts and negotiations himself, which gave me both an advantage and a target. Jared flagged discrepancies immediately, missed inspections, inflated invoices, and, most damning of all, kickbacks from subcontractors who shouldn't have been hired in the first place. I felt a cold satisfaction settle over me as the evidence piled up. You think he's dumb enough to keep records? Jared asked as we sifted through another round of emails. He's dumb enough to think no one's watching, I said. That's worse. Tyler had always been arrogant. It was part of his charm when we were younger, that effortless confidence that made people believe he could do anything. But arrogance is dangerous in business. It makes you sloppy. It makes you think the rules don't apply to you. And Tyler had broken plenty of rules. Rebecca, my investigator, was quick to follow up on what Jared and I found. She tracked financial records, traced cash payments, and dug into subcontractor histories. By the end of the week, she handed me a neatly compiled folder with more than enough to sink him. Your brother's a piece of work, she said as she slid the folder across the table. Tell me something I don't know, I muttered, flipping through the documents. She leaned back, crossing her arms. I don't just mean the work stuff. He's been running his mouth at bars, bragging about the arrangement he has with your wife. That's not someone who thinks they'll ever be held accountable. I closed the folder slowly, my jaw tightening. He's about to learn. Next came Madison. I didn't need Rebecca for this part. I already knew where to look. Madison wasn't as sloppy as Tyler, her lies were neater, polished, harder to trace. But she had a weakness, her obsession with appearances. She loved the spotlight, the admiration, the envy. And that kind of craving always left a trail. Her emails were a gold mine. Client correspondences, scheduling conflicts, and one glaring thread between her and Tyler. The language was coded, careful, but there was no mistaking the context. Every meeting, every late-night rendezvous, every stolen moment, it was all there, hidden in plain sight. But the real treasure came when I checked her accounts. Joint expenses I hadn't noticed before, a hotel suite in Aspen, dinners at restaurants I'd never been to, jewelry that had never made its way into our home. I took screenshots of everything, each piece of evidence another brick in the case I was building. And then I found the safety deposit box. I hadn't known it existed until I checked our banking history more closely. The box was under both her and Tyler's names, rented 3 years ago, the same time their affair began. I felt a grim sense of vindication as I stared at the transaction records. Whatever they were hiding in that box, it was worth keeping secret from me. Rebecca offered to dig further, but I stopped her. I wanted to see it myself. There's something about holding proof in your hands, something that makes the betrayal feel real in a way photos and screenshots can't. That Friday, I drove to the bank and requested access to the box. The clerk barely glanced at the paperwork before leading me to the vault. My name was still on the account. Madison must have been so confident in her lies, so sure I'd never dig this deep, that she hadn't bothered to cover her tracks. When the box was placed in front of me, my hands didn't shake. I opened it slowly, methodically, like peeling back a wound that had been festering for too long. Inside, there were documents, property records, financial statements, and a collection of photos that made my stomach twist. It wasn't just their affair they'd been hiding. It was fraud. The property records were falsified, the financial statements doctored to inflate their earnings. They'd used Madison's real estate clients as pawns, forging signatures and manipulating property values to pocket the difference. Tyler had been the architect of the scheme, but Madison had executed it flawlessly, her charm and professionalism convincing everyone she was above reproach. I stared at the papers for a long time, the weight of what I'd found pressing down on me. This wasn't just about infidelity anymore. This was criminal. And it was my family's name they were dragging through the mud. I packed everything back into the box and handed it to the clerk with a polite smile. "I'll be closing this account soon," I said. "Just a heads up." She nodded, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface. By the time I got home, it was late. Madison was in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine. She looked up when I walked in, her smile too bright, too practiced. "You're home late," she said, setting the glass down. "Work," I replied, shrugging out of my jacket. "Henderson's a mess." She nodded, her expression softening. "That's why you're so good at what you do. You fix things." The irony of her words was almost unbearable. I stared at her, wondering how many lies she had told me over the years. How many times she had looked me in the eye and pretended everything was fine. "Yeah," I said finally. "That's what I do." Later, after she'd gone to bed, I sat in my office and spread the evidence across my desk. The photos, the documents, the emails, it was all there, a roadmap of betrayal and deceit. My hands were steady as I sorted through it, each piece falling into place like the foundation of a new structure. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. They thought they were untouchable. They thought they could build their lives without consequence. But the thing about cracks is that they always spread, and eventually, the whole structure collapses. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of it all settling in my chest. I wasn't just going to tear down what they built. I was going to make sure they could never rebuild. The morning after my visit to the bank, I woke up feeling clearer than I had in weeks. The storm inside me had quieted, replaced by a cold, deliberate focus. The evidence was there. The cracks weren't just showing, they were gaping holes, ready to swallow Madison and Tyler whole. And I was ready to push them in. I spent the day preparing. Jared came by the office around noon, a bag of sandwiches in hand, but we both knew this wasn't a social visit. He set the food on my desk, his expression grim as I pulled out the folder of evidence. "This everything?" he asked, flipping through the pages. "For now," I said. "There's more at the house. Photos, receipts, emails. Enough to bury them both." Jared nodded, tapping the folder with his finger. "The fraud stuff, it's serious. We're not just talking about a slap on the wrist here. This could mean jail time." "That's the idea," I said, my voice steady. "They wanted to play games. Now they get to see what losing looks like." Jared leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "And Sophia? How's she holding up?" The mention of her name hit me harder than I expected. I'd been so focused on gathering evidence, so consumed by the need to dismantle everything Madison and Tyler had built, that I hadn't let myself think about what it meant for her. She didn't know yet, couldn't know, but I could already see the cracks forming in her world, too. "She's fine," I said, though the word felt hollow. "For now." "Ethan," Jared said, leaning forward. "Whatever you're planning, whatever happens, don't let them drag her down with them." His words stuck with me long after he left. I knew he was right. Sophia was innocent in all of this, and I owed it to her to protect what little stability she had left. But I also knew that once the truth came out, there was no way to shield her completely. The fallout was coming, and she'd be caught in it, whether I liked it or not. That evening, I found myself standing in the doorway to her room, watching as she worked on another one of her drawings. She was so focused, her tongue sticking out slightly as she sketched, that she didn't notice me at first. Her pencils were scattered across the floor, and the latest drawing was taped to the wall, a family portrait, but this one was different. The storm clouds were still there, heavy and dark, but this time, the figures were closer together. Madison and Tyler were off to one side, their hands barely touching. Sophia stood in the middle, her arms stretched out as though she was trying to hold everyone together. And then there was me, standing on the other side, my arms crossed, watching them from a distance. "What do you think?" she asked, looking up at me. I stepped into the room, kneeling beside her to get a closer look. "It's interesting," I said carefully. "Why am I standing so far away?" She shrugged, her eyes drifting back to the picture. "That's how it feels sometimes." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't want to ask what she meant. I wasn't sure I could handle the answer. Instead, I reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You're a good artist, Soph," I said quietly. "You see things most people don't." She smiled at that, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. The next day, I made my move. Madison had a meeting that evening, a vague excuse I didn't bother questioning. Tyler was out of town, or so he'd claimed, but I knew better. Rebecca's last report confirmed that they were meeting at the same hotel, like clockwork. I let them think they were safe, that their secret was still intact, even as I pulled the strings tighter around them. Before Madison left, I kissed her on the cheek, the gesture that felt both foreign and calculated. She hesitated, her eyes searching mine for something she didn't find, then smiled that perfect, practiced smile and walked out the door. As soon as her car disappeared down the street, I went to work. The evidence was already laid out in the office, the photos, the emails, the financial records, but I added one final piece, the flash drive Rebecca had delivered that morning, loaded with surveillance footage from their latest rendezvous. It was damning, every second of it. Tyler's hand on Madison's back as they walked into the hotel. The way they lingered too long in the lobby, their heads bent close as though the rest of the world didn't exist. And then, the final shot, them entering the elevator together, the doors closing behind them. I copied everything onto my laptop, then uploaded it to a private cloud account. If Madison and Tyler thought they could outsmart me, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. When Madison came home that night, I was waiting in the living room, a glass of bourbon in hand. The TV was on, the volume low, but I wasn't watching it. I stared at the screen, my thoughts a cold, calculated hum in the back of my mind. "You're up late," she said, kicking off her heels and setting her bag on the table. "So are you," I replied, not looking at her. She hesitated, then walked over to the couch, sitting on the armrest. "Long day?" "Something like that." She reached out, resting a hand on my shoulder. The gesture felt foreign, almost alien, and I had to fight the urge to pull away. "Ethan," she said softly, "is everything okay?" I turned to her then, my eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, I considered telling her. Laying it all out right then and there, watching the mask she wore crumble into dust. But I didn't. "Not yet." "Everything's fine," I said, my voice steady. "Go to bed. You look tired." She frowned, as though she wanted to say more, but eventually nodded and stood. "Good night," she said, leaning down to kiss my cheek. I didn't respond. I just watched as she walked upstairs, her footsteps soft against the hardwood. When I was sure she was asleep, I made the second move. I sent an email to Jared, attaching the evidence we'd gathered so far, along with instructions for the next phase. Then I sent a second email, to Rebecca, with a subject line that simply read, "Proceed." The third email was the hardest. It was to my lawyer, detailing everything I'd discovered and requesting a meeting to discuss my next steps. The words felt heavy as I typed them, each sentence a reminder of just how far this had gone. By the time I hit send, my hands were shaking. It was done. The first domino had been pushed, and there was no stopping it now. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the darkened screen. In the distance, I could hear the faint hum of rain against the windows, the steady rhythm somehow comforting. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The cracks were spreading, and soon, the entire foundation would collapse. The morning after I sent those emails, the world didn't end. Madison came downstairs in her usual routine, making coffee and scrolling through her phone, oblivious to the avalanche I'd set in motion. She greeted me with a half-smile, the kind that used to feel warm but now felt like a mask. "How'd you sleep?" she asked, her voice light. "Like a baby," I replied, sipping my coffee and watching her over the rim of the mug. She didn't notice the edge in my tone. She never noticed much these days. Sophia came down next, her hair a tangled mess, still rubbing sleep from her eyes. She sat at the table, kicking her legs under her chair, and Madison kissed her on the head like it was just another Tuesday. I wondered if Sophia would remember this moment years from now, the last morning before the truth came crashing down. "I'm taking you to school today," I told Sophia, setting my mug down. Her face lit up. "Really? Can we stop for donuts?" "Of course," I said, smiling for real this time. What kind of dad would I be if I said no to donuts? Madison glanced at me, a flicker of something crossing her face. Suspicion? Confusion? Whatever it was, she didn't say anything. She just nodded and turned back to her coffee. After dropping Sophia off, I drove to Jared's office. He was waiting for me, the folder of evidence already spread across his desk. He looked up as I walked in, his expression grim. "We're ready," he said. "You sure about this?" I nodded, sitting across from him. It's not about being sure anymore. It's about doing what has to be done. Jared leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. The fraud alone is enough to bury them, but the personal stuff. It's messy, Ethan. Are you ready for that? I stared at the folder, the weight of it pressing down on me. They made it messy. I'm just cleaning it up. Jared didn't argue. He just handed me a printout of our timeline, detailing every step we'd take in the next few weeks. It was methodical, precise, just the way I needed it to be. If Madison and Tyler thought they could keep me in the dark forever, they were about to learn how wrong they were. That evening, I set the first fire. It was subtle, a spark, not a blaze. Over dinner, I let a comment slip, something innocuous on the surface but loaded with meaning underneath. "So, how's Tyler doing these days?" I asked casually, cutting into my steak. Madison froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. She recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. "He's fine," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," I said, keeping my voice light. "I haven't seen him around much lately. Seems like he's been busy." Madison didn't look up. "Yeah, he's been working on a big project. Lots of late nights." I nodded, taking a sip of my wine. "Funny. I thought he was out of town." Her hand tightened on her fork, just enough for me to notice. She didn't answer. Sophia, oblivious to the tension, chimed in with a story about her day at school, and the moment passed. But the seed was planted. Madison was smart enough to know something was off, and that was exactly what I wanted. The next fire wasn't so subtle. A few days later, I drove to Margaret Doyle's house. She was in her garden as always, pruning her roses with the kind of care most people reserved for their children. When she saw me, she smiled, though there was a sharpness in her eyes that hadn't dulled in all the years I'd known her. "Ethan Caldwell," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "What brings you by?" I leaned on the fence, watching as she snipped another stem. "I need a favor, Margaret." Her eyebrows went up. "A favor? From me? This must be serious." "It is," I said. "And I think you're the only one who can help." She set down her clippers, tilting her head. "I'm listening." I told her everything. Not the full details, just enough to make my point. She didn't interrupt, her sharp eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, she nodded slowly, as though she'd known all along. "I've seen things," she said, her voice low. "Tyler's car here when it shouldn't be. Madison leaving in a hurry when you're not home. I've tried to warn you before, you know." "I remember," I said. "And I'm sorry I didn't listen. But I'm listening now." She studied me for a moment, then nodded again. "All right, Ethan. What do you need?" "Just keep watching," I said. "And if you see anything, let me know." Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You can count on me." The next fire was unavoidable. It happened the following Saturday, at a barbecue Tyler hosted at his house. Jared convinced me to go, arguing that keeping up appearances was crucial to our plan. I hated every second of it, but he was right. If I wanted this to work, I had to play the part. Madison was there, of course, laughing and smiling as though nothing was wrong. Tyler was the perfect host, flipping burgers and telling stories that made everyone laugh. The sight of them together, so comfortable, so natural, made my blood boil. And then it happened. I was standing by the grill, a beer in hand, when I heard them. Tyler and Madison, just out of earshot from the others, their voices low but unmistakable. "You need to be more careful," Madison was saying, her tone sharp. "Ethan's been asking questions." "He doesn't know anything," Tyler replied, his voice dripping with arrogance. "He's too busy playing house to notice." I gripped the beer bottle so tightly I thought it might shatter. They didn't see me, didn't even think to check if I was nearby. They were so confident, so sure of themselves, that they didn't realize they were playing with fire. When Tyler turned to head back to the grill, I stepped into his path. He froze, his eyes widening for a split second before he forced a grin. "Ethan! Didn't see you there." "Funny," I said, my voice calm. "I've been right here." He didn't respond, his grin faltering. Madison appeared behind him, her smile too bright, too forced. I let the moment stretch, the silence thick and heavy, before finally walking away. It wasn't time. Not yet. But soon. The days after Tyler's barbecue were a blur of quiet planning and restrained fury. Every time I replayed their whispered exchange in my head, it felt like gasoline on the fire inside me. They were so casual, so dismissive, like I was some blind fool incapable of seeing what was right in front of me. But they didn't know me. Not really. They'd never seen what I was capable of. I started small, the way you test a weak beam to see how much weight it can handle before it snaps. Madison and I sat down for dinner 2 nights after the barbecue, the kind of quiet, routine meal we'd been having for months. She was scrolling through her phone, barely paying attention, until I spoke. "Tyler seems stressed lately," I said, cutting into my chicken. Her head snapped up, her smile carefully neutral. "Does he?" I hadn't noticed. I shrugged, chewing thoughtfully. "Yeah. He mentioned something about deadlines." Seemed distracted. Madison's hand tightened around her glass of wine. "Well, you know Tyler. He's always got something going on." "I guess," I said, letting the silence hang between us for a moment. Then, casually, "Do you see him much during the day? With all these meetings you're always running off to?" She froze, just for a second, but it was enough. Her smile faltered, her eyes darting back to her phone. "Not really," she said, too quickly. "We're both busy. You know how it is." I nodded, letting the conversation drop, but the seed was planted. She knew I was watching now, and I could feel her starting to squirm. The next step was Tyler. I called him late that night, knowing he'd pick up. He always did when I called, guilt, probably. Or maybe arrogance. Either way, it worked. "Ethan," he said, his voice slurred. "What's up, man?" "Got a question for you," I said, keeping my tone light. "Henderson. Did you handle the permits on that one?" There was a pause, just long enough to tell me he wasn't sure where this was going. Yeah," he said finally. "Why?" "Just curious," I said. "Jared flagged something in the invoices. Thought you'd know more about it." Another pause. "Invoices?" "Yeah," I said. "Something about subcontractor payments not matching the work logs. Doesn't look like a big deal, but, you know, Jared. He's thorough." Tyler laughed, a forced, nervous sound. "Right. Jared's a stickler. I'll look into it." "Appreciate it," I said, my voice calm. "Oh, and Tyler?" "Yeah? Don't let it slip through the cracks. Wouldn't want anything to come back on us." His laugh was thinner this time, strained. "Yeah. Of course." I hung up, satisfied. Tyler was starting to feel the pressure, and it wouldn't take much to push him over the edge. Rebecca came through the next day with more evidence, The kind that could sink a career, or a marriage. She'd found a second burner phone registered to Madison, hidden under a fake name. The texts between her and Tyler were explicit, damning, impossible to explain away. I read through them once, then set the phone down, my stomach churning. It wasn't just the affair. It was the way they talked about me, like I was a joke. Like I was some clueless idiot too busy building my empire to notice the cracks in my own house. He doesn't suspect a thing. Ethan's always at work. We've got nothing to worry about. Sometimes I think he'd rather be with his blueprints than with me. I clenched my fists, the anger boiling just under the surface. They'd built their lies on my time, my trust, my sacrifices. And now they were laughing about it. I sent the texts to Jared and Rebecca, asking them to add it to the file. The noose was tightening, and I wanted every thread in place before I pulled. The breaking point came 3 days later. I was at the office, reviewing site plans, when I got a call from Margaret. Her voice was sharp, urgent, cutting through the static hum of my thoughts. "Ethan, you might want to come home," she said. "Now? What's going on?" I asked, already grabbing my keys. "It's Tyler," she said. "His car's in your driveway. Madison just got home 10 minutes ago." I didn't wait for more. I was out the door and in my truck before she finished speaking, the engine roaring to life as I peeled out of the parking lot. The drive home was a blur of headlights and fury, the kind of cold, focused rage that makes your hands steady even when your heart is pounding. When I pulled into the driveway, Tyler's car was there, just like Margaret said. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through me, but I pushed it down. Not yet. Not here. I parked on the street, cutting the engine and sitting in silence for a moment. The house was quiet, the lights in the living room glowing softly through the curtains. I could see shadows moving inside, Tyler's tall, lean frame and Madison's smaller silhouette. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. I got out of the truck, my footsteps deliberate as I approached the front door. The cold metal of the spare key burned against my palm as I unlocked it, pushing the door open without a sound. Their voices carried through the hall, low and muffled. I followed the sound to the kitchen, where they were standing too close, their heads bent together. Tyler was laughing, that same cocky, insufferable laugh that had grated on me my whole life. Madison was smiling, her hand resting lightly on his arm. They didn't see me at first. It wasn't until I stepped into the room that they froze, their smiles evaporating in an instant. "Don't stop on my account," I said, my voice cold and sharp. "I wouldn't want to interrupt." Madison stepped back, her hand dropping from Tyler's arm. "Ethan," she said, her voice trembling. "What are you doing home?" I ignored her, my eyes locked on Tyler. "Funny," I said. "I was about to ask you the same thing." He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. For once, the man who always had something to say was silent. The room was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, each second stretching out like a lifetime. Madison looked between us, her face pale, her lips trembling. "Ethan," she said again, softer this time. "Let me explain." I took a step forward, my eyes never leaving hers. "Oh, don't worry," I said. "You'll have plenty of time to explain. But not to me." I pulled my phone from my pocket and hit play. The audio recording of their conversation at the barbecue filled the room, their words hanging in the air like a noose. Madison's face crumpled, her hand flying to her mouth. Tyler took a step back, his eyes wide, his bravado gone. "You think I didn't know?" I said, my voice rising. "You think I didn't see the cracks? You've been lying to me for years, both of you, and now you're going to pay for it." The silence that followed was deafening. The silence stretched so long it became suffocating. Madison was still frozen, her hand clamped over her mouth, as if that could stop the truth from spilling out. Tyler looked like a cornered animal, his bravado completely stripped away, replaced by something closer to fear. Good. They should be afraid. You've been planning this, Madison finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. How long have you known? I stepped closer, feeling the weight of their deceit pressing down on me like a tidal wave. Long enough, I said coldly. Long enough to see through every lie you've told. Long enough to realize you thought I'd never notice. Tyler tried to speak, his voice cracking under the pressure. Ethan, listen. No, I snapped, turning my glare on him. You don't get to talk. Not after what you've done. You betrayed me, Tyler. Not just as a brother, but as a man. You took everything I gave you, trust, loyalty, respect, and pissed on it. He flinched, his jaw tightening, but he didn't deny it. He couldn't. Not with everything I'd uncovered. Madison stepped forward then, her eyes wide, pleading. Ethan, please. You don't understand. Don't I? I cut her off, my voice sharp and unrelenting. I've seen the receipts. The hotel bookings. The emails. I've seen everything, Madison. You don't get to play the victim now. Her face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks, but they didn't move me. Not this time. I wasn't the man she could manipulate with a well-timed sob or a soft apology. That man was gone, and all that was left was the one standing in front of her now. You think crying is going to fix this? I said, my voice low and biting. Do you think tears are going to erase 3 years of betrayal? Of lies? You made your choices, Madison. Now you get to live with them. She collapsed into a chair, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed into her hands. Tyler stayed where he was, his back pressed against the counter like he was trying to disappear. I almost laughed at the sight of him, the man who'd always been so sure of himself, now reduced to nothing. The next step was as calculated as the first. I walked to the kitchen table, pulled out the thick envelope I'd brought with me, and tossed it onto the surface. The sound made Madison flinch. What's this? She whispered, her voice hoarse. Your downfall, I said, sitting across from her. Everything you've done. The fraud. The forged documents. The affair. It's all in there. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. Ethan, you can't. I can, I interrupted, my voice firm. And I will. This isn't just about what you did to me. It's about what you did to everyone. The clients you lied to, the money you stole, the reputation you dragged through the mud. You think I'm just going to let you walk away from that? She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Please, Ethan. We can fix this. We can go to counseling, start over. Start over? I said, laughing bitterly. There's nothing to start over with, Madison. You burned it all to the ground. I turned to Tyler, who had finally found his voice. Ethan, we can work this out. We're family. No, I said, cutting him off. We were family. You destroyed that the second you touched my wife. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his shoulders slumping in defeat. For once, he didn't have anything to say. The fallout came quickly. The next morning, I met with my lawyer, handing over everything Rebecca and I had uncovered. The photos, the texts, the financial records, it was enough to dismantle Madison and Tyler's lives completely. From there, it spiraled. The real estate board launched an investigation into Madison's practices, suspending her license pending further review. Tyler's shady dealings on the Henderson project came to light, leading to a full audit of his work. Every corner they'd cut, every lie they'd told, was dragged into the light. Their perfect little world crumbled, and I watched it happen with a cold, detached satisfaction. But the hardest part was Sophia. She didn't understand at first, and I didn't blame her. How could an 8-year-old comprehend the kind of betrayal that had torn her family apart? She came to me one night, clutching one of her drawings, her eyes filled with tears. "Daddy," she said, her voice trembling. "Why are you and Mommy fighting so much?" I knelt down, pulling her into my arms. "It's not your fault, Soph," I said, my throat tightening. "None of this is your fault." "But you're always angry," she said, her voice breaking. "And Mommy's always crying. What's wrong?" I didn't know what to say. How could I explain to her that the life we'd built together had been a lie? That the woman she called her mother had betrayed me in ways I couldn't forgive? That the man she thought of as an uncle had destroyed everything we'd worked for? I kissed the top of her head, holding her close. "I'm going to fix it," I said softly. "I promise. I'm going to make it better." The final confrontation came 2 weeks later, in the conference room of my lawyer's office. Madison and Tyler sat across from me, their faces pale and drawn, as my lawyer laid out the terms of the divorce and the evidence we'd gathered. "You'll sign the papers," I said, my voice calm but unyielding. "You'll waive any claims to the house or the business. And you'll take full responsibility for the fraud. If you don't, I'll take this to court, and I guarantee you won't like the outcome." Madison stared at me, her eyes hollow. "Ethan, please." "There's no please, Madison," I said, leaning forward. "This is me being generous. Don't mistake it for mercy." Tyler didn't say a word. He just stared at the table, his hands clenched into fists. The room was silent as the lawyer slid the papers across the table. Madison hesitated, her hand shaking as she picked up the pen. She signed, her tears dripping onto the page, smudging the ink. Tyler followed, his signature quick and angry. It was over. When I walked out of that room, the weight that had been crushing me for months finally lifted. The life I'd built was gone, but the foundation was still there. And I knew I could rebuild. As I drove home, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light across the city. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. But I wasn't done yet. Madison and Tyler would face the consequences of their actions, and I would make sure they couldn't hurt anyone else the way they'd hurt me. Justice was coming. And I was the one bringing it. The fallout came in waves, slow at first, then relentless. Madison and Tyler thought they could contain it, smooth it over with apologies and excuses, but they underestimated how thoroughly I'd exposed them. This wasn't just about their betrayal. This was about dismantling everything they'd built on lies. Madison was the first to fall. The real estate board acted swiftly, suspending her license and launching a formal investigation into the fraudulent deals. Clients she'd charmed with her perfect smile and polished confidence came forward, each one bringing another piece of evidence to add to the pile. The forgery, the doctored records, the inflated property values, it all came crashing down. She tried to fight it at first, hiring a lawyer to salvage what she could. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the penalties were severe. Fines, restitution, and a permanent stain on her name in the industry she once ruled. She lost everything, her career, her reputation, and, eventually, her social circle. The people who used to flock to her for advice and connections now avoided her like a plague. I heard through the grapevine that she'd moved into a small apartment on the edge of town, a far cry from the sprawling home she once flaunted. She kept to herself, avoiding public places and prying eyes. She'd become a shadow of the woman who had once basked in the spotlight. Tyler's fall was uglier. He tried to bluff his way out, denying everything and claiming he'd been set up. But the audit of the Henderson project revealed enough irregularities to strip him of his contractor's license. The kickbacks, the forged permits, the shortcuts, it all came to light. When the subcontractors he'd paid off started turning on him, desperate to save their own skins, Tyler's bravado crumbled. He was hit with multiple lawsuits from clients whose properties had been compromised by his negligence. His name became synonymous with failure, a cautionary tale whispered among construction circles. I heard he tried to find work in another state, but word traveled fast. No one wanted to hire a man with his track record, especially not one tainted by fraud. The last I heard, he was living in a dingy rental, working odd jobs to make ends meet. For a man who had always prided himself on being the life of the party, the center of attention, Tyler's isolation was the cruelest blow of all. But it wasn't just about them. Sophia was still caught in the crossfire, and she was the one person I couldn't let slip through the cracks. I fought for custody with everything I had, laying out the evidence of Madison's instability and Tyler's toxic influence. The judge listened as my lawyer presented photos, recordings, and testimony from Sophia's school counselor. It wasn't just about the affair, it was about the environment Madison and Tyler had created, one built on deceit and emotional neglect. When the ruling came down in my favor, granting me full custody, I felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly brought me to my knees. Sophia was mine to protect now, free from the lies and chaos that had surrounded her. Our first night together in the new house was quiet. It was smaller than the one we'd left behind, but it felt more like home. Sophia helped me unpack boxes, her laughter filling the empty spaces as we worked. For the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't expected, peace. She found an old photo of the three of us, me, Madison, and her, taken at a park when she was 5. She stared at it for a long time before looking up at me. "Do you hate her?" she asked, her voice small. The question caught me off guard. I set down the box I was carrying and knelt beside her. "No," I said honestly. "I don't hate her. I hate what she did. I hate the lies. But I don't hate her." Sophia nodded, her brow furrowed in thought. "Do you still love her?" That question was harder. I thought about it for a long moment before answering. "I don't know if I ever loved the real her," I said finally. "But I love you. And that's what matters." She smiled then, a small, shy smile, and I knew we'd be okay. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding. Not just my life, but myself. The business flourished, with Jared and I taking on bigger projects and cementing our reputation as one of the most reliable firms in Denver. It felt good to pour myself into something solid, something real. But it wasn't just about work. Sophia and I built something new together, a routine, a rhythm that felt like ours. We had movie nights and pancake breakfasts, hikes in the mountains, and quiet evenings where she sketched while I worked on blueprints. The scars of what we'd been through didn't fade completely, but they became part of us, a reminder of how far we'd come. Madison tried to reach out once, a carefully worded letter that arrived in the mail 6 months after the divorce. She apologized, said she wanted to explain, to make amends. I didn't reply. Some bridges are meant to stay burned. Tyler didn't bother. He knew better. Sophia thrived in the new environment. Her drawings changed, the storm clouds disappearing, replaced by bright colors and sturdy shapes. She started talking about becoming an architect, just like me, and I couldn't have been prouder. One night, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, she leaned her head against my shoulder. "You were right," she said softly. "About what?" "About fixing things. You made it better." I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her close. "We made it better," I said. "Together." The justice I sought wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about truth. About pulling down the false walls Madison and Tyler had built and showing the world what lay beneath. And in the end, it wasn't my actions that destroyed them, it was their own choices. their own lies. I'd been broken, but I wasn't defeated. I'd rebuilt, stronger and more certain than ever. And this time, the foundation wouldn't crack. As I sat there with Sophia, the weight of the past finally lifting, I realized something: I hadn't just survived. I'd won. Years later, as Sophia graduated college with honors in architectural design, I stood in the audience, watching her accept her diploma. She was stronger than I could have ever imagined, her resilience a reflection of everything we'd been through. When she turned to look at me, her smile wide and genuine, I felt a sense of pride so deep it nearly brought me to tears. We'd built something beautiful together, something honest, something real. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all.